Hi guys, thanks for tuning in. I wanted to share a cool case that came through the lab this week. So let's get started. This was a young man who was referred to me for ventricular tachycardia. And so whenever you're looking at a tracing and you have a tachycardia that you're dealing with, you always want to start by looking at the initiation. You can see here that he's actually in a sinus tach here, and then he goes into wide complex tachycardia here. So with any wide complex tachycardia, you want to go through your differential, which is either it's ventricular tachycardia, it could be an SVT with aberrancy, it could be a pre-excited tachycardia, or a tachycardia that's mediated by a pacemaker. We know this patient doesn't have a pacemaker, so that's out. We don't see any manifest pre-excitation in the narrow beats, so that's pretty unlikely. So we're left with SVT with aberrancy, or VT. We only have the luxury of one lead here, so we have to work with what we have. I don't see any evidence of AV dissociation, so that doesn't really help us, and that's pretty much it. So if we go to the next slide, you always want to look at termination as well. And what you see here is actually pretty interesting. You see this wide complex tachycardia that terminates, but it terminates with really 3 narrow beats. Now, if this cycle length here was the same as here, then you can take it to the bank that it's probably an SVT with aberrancy. What bothers me here, to just jump to the conclusion that this is an SVT, is that this cycle length is actually a little bit slower than this cycle length. So could you have a VT that breaks with an SVT at a slower rate? It's pretty unlikely. I guess if you had one-to-one VA conduction and you set up some kind of SVT, it's possible. Can you have an SVT that breaks with the pattern of slowing? And the answer is yes. Frequently with atrial tachycardias, we'll see slowing of the tach before termination. So this certainly could be an atrial tachycardia with slowing and then termination. So I certainly went into the case thinking that SVT was definitely a possibility, but the truth is in the lab, so that's where we took him. And you can see here, he actually goes into the SVT spontaneously on his own. You have a sinus beat here. CS is in the traditional location, with 1-2 being in the distal part of the mitral annulus, so in the left atrial side. You have a PAC here, and then another PAC here that conducts to this V, and then you have A that follows that. And if the first thing that should jump out at you is that the retrograde atrial activation is eccentric, with earliest being 3-4. So the SVT differential is always the same, no matter what the case is. It's always going to be either AV-NRT, typical or atypical, AV-RT, or atrial tachycardia. Now, there have been reports of AV-NRT with left-sided inputs, such that the retrograde limb of the AV-NRT circuit is inserting into the left atrium somewhere, and that would give you an eccentric pattern, but that is extremely rare. So in general, if you have eccentric activation like this, most often the differential is going to be either an atrial tachycardia coming from the left side or AV-RT using an accessory pathway with a left-sided insertion. So as soon as we saw this, the next thing we wanted to do was entrain from the ventricle. And the first thing you always have to make sure is that you've actually entrained the tachycardia. So I've, in this case, advanced the atrial cycle length here to the cycle length of my pacing. And what you have is a VA and then you have HV. So a VAV response, which essentially rules out atrial tachycardia. You would expect to see a VAAV with atrial tachycardia. And then if you wanted to, it's a good exercise. I measured the post-pacing interval, and the PPI minus tachycardia cycle length was less than 150 milliseconds, and the stim to A minus the V to A was less than 85 milliseconds. So everything was pointing us to ORT using a concealed left-sided pathway. One other nice finding that occurred is we saw the tachycardia in its narrow complex form. And if you measure the VA here, and you can just choose a fiduciary point, I used, I think, CS56, The V to A was 91 milliseconds, and then he went into spontaneously left bundle branch block. So actually, what you expect if the pathway is on the left side is for the VA to push out, which it did. So when you see your VA timing increase, when you have bundle branch block ipsilateral to the side of the pathway, that's diagnostic of a circuit involving an accessory pathway. So this is, there's no bystander here. This is ORT using a left lateral accessory pathway. And this finding cements that. Now, if you recall, going back to the earlier slide when we had the 14-day monitor, this was the opposite of what we saw. Actually, we saw the narrow complex was a little bit slower. So I don't have a great explanation for that. That might explain the loss of aberrancy, but if anything, the left bundle tachycardia cycle length should have been a little bit slower. But in this case, in the lab, this was a very nice thing to see, and certainly made it all the more sure that we had the right diagnosis. Okay, so let's see. This is open window mapping. So I mapped while pacing the ventricle. And I think this is a really helpful technique. Basically, it allows you to localize the general region where, in this case, the pathway would be. And then you can use, it's not a substitute for electrograms, but once you've gotten the general region, then you can use your catheter, ablation catheter, to really fine tune it. And this also maps, generally to where we thought it would map to based on the CS activation, which is sort of posterior lateral left atrium. So I'm going to try and play this here. And what you can see is the wavefront. I'm just going to back it up a little bit so you can see. You can see that it breaks through right by those dots. And that's very helpful in terms of being able to get a sense for where the pathway is. The other thing that's kind of cool that we saw here is as we flip this around, it looks like there's no other activation going up to the atrium other than that pathway. i.e., I don't think based on this map there's any evidence of nodal activation. If you had both nodal and pathway activation, essentially fusion between the two to the atrium, then you would probably see something breaking through on the septum. And in fact, that's what we found once we got rid of the pathway, which I'll show you on the next slide. There was no retrograde atrial activation up the node. So this is us ablating here, and you can see if you look, let's see if I can point it out. Yeah, right here, you see that we got the pathway, and there's no activation back up to the atrium after that occurs. So that took, we measured about 2.8 seconds, which is good. Anything longer than 3-4 seconds, you're probably not in the right spot. And certainly if you're burning and it takes 10 seconds to go away, you're not in the right spot and it's likely to come back. So I'm pretty happy with 2.8 seconds. I felt like, we were pretty much on it, or close enough to it. And we waited for 30 minutes and it didn't come back. So that was the case that I wanted to share with you. A couple cool findings, and thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned for more content.